Okay, folks, today we're going to be looking at, as I said last week, Causewayed enclosure sites. Now, Bill will be very aware of what a Causewayed enclosure site is, and we're gonna have a good. We're gonna try and dive into understanding what a Causewayed enclosure site is in 3 different parts of the country, and we're going to be and then we're going to be looking at Causewayed enclosure site or something similar on Orkney. So what you should be seeing at this minute is a field. Is that correct, Bill?
Absolutely.
Right. So, Bill, we've come across the word Causewayed enclosure a few times in the past. What is your interpretation of what a Causewayed enclosure is?
Well, it's basically a burial site in a circular formation where pits were actually dug on the remains of people who were put in there. Eventually that joined up on the central part was, I think, kept for sky burials.
Right. Actually, that's pretty good.
The sky burials came first, and then when the bones were bare, they were put in the pits, the circular pits.
All that's relevant. Yeah, we'll use all that. So I said about 3 areas of Britain. So we've got a Causewayed enclosure site in Cornwall. We've got several in Cymru. We've got one in Cumbria, and we got the Causewayed enclosure equivalent in Orkney, and that takes us to a site that Bill and I have visited, and Pat's been there as well. Most of the other sites, it's unlikely that any of you will have been to. So to introduce what these Causewayed enclosure sites are, I've got little examples from other parts of the country. And Bill's description is very right in what he said. A Causewayed enclosure site is an arrangement of ditches in a concentric circle, and in between there's a causeway. So to sort of reiterate that, each of these represents a ditch, and you can see that that's been sectioned, and this here represents a causeway. So these are popularly known as Causewayed enclosures. And if you want to be slightly more descriptive, basically a string of sausages. And the one behind me is a string of sausages in the middle, string of sausages outside, another string of sausages, and another string of sausages. That site is known as Windmill Hill, which is near Avebury. And these sites themselves all arrive in the period of the Neolithic. So we go back 5,000 years ago, or 6,000 years ago. Lots of places in Britain that have stone circles associated with them, like Stonehenge, started off as a Causewayed enclosure site. And Bill was very right. In what you find in the middle of these sites is a platform, and it's a raised platform off the ground, 1 meter or so. One of your loved ones passed on, you would put your loved one on that platform naked, and you would then leave them on that platform, and over the months, birds would peck at the meat, the flesh, and obviously the eyes and all the rest of it. All the soft tissues would go, and then what would happen is that the longer bones, the humerus, the femur, the skull, and maybe the lower mandible and some other bones would be collected together, and then they would be placed in these ditches. And we do believe that these ditches represent an individual family. Causewayed enclosure sites used to be very rare in Britain. Up until 1990 odd, we probably had 1, maybe 2 Causewayed enclosure sites that had ever been found in Cymru. That was it. But since 1990, there's been examples found in West Wales and in North Wales, and at a place that I'd been field walking, not realizing that the site we'd been field walking was in fact a Causewayed enclosure site. And the reason why we had a little bit of a delay as well, not just waiting for Ellen, I wanted to put a finishing touch to the lecture to show you the place where a Causewayed enclosure site was actually found in 1997. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. There's a little bit of fun on that as well. So this is a site in Berkshire. And what I wanted to sort of do is talk about what we're seeing really. So this Neolithic Causewayed enclosure discovered in Berkshire is something that was actually excavated very, very recently. It was found in an open field. Actually, Causewayed enclosures is a completely another lecture if we want to spend an hour, 2 hours on Causewayed enclosures. But I just want to look at the differences in these sites and look at the comparisons. But there are a number being found. There's about 100 known examples in Britain now, from Cornwall into Cymru, the rest of England, all the way Scotland, and then the similarity, the similar sites, sky burial sites in Orkney, but they're very different than these, for example. So this site itself is a good example of a site that's actually been found by accident, using aerial photography, and it was a good exercise. I know I call it Berkshire, near Windsor Castle. Lots of these sites, lots of these Causewayed enclosure sites cover maybe an acre of land. They sometimes drape off the side of the hill. They're sometimes on really slight tumps, but they're meant to be seen. And that's a key point. Where does the earth go? Well, the image behind me shows quite clearly that you've got the ditch, and then the earth is raised behind. And this is what's going on. Lots of these are where the ditches and banks have actually been joined together, but it is a reconstructed drawing. And the site that you're actually seeing on the screen has an estimated perimeter of 500 meters. So it's quite, quite an area. So half a kilometer in an area. What you can see is approximately half that's been excavated. Lots of these sites rarely survive in their initial state. In fact, it's very rare that you actually get the bank surviving, because remember, these sites themselves go back 6,000 years, 5,500 years, 6,000 years. So it's a long time ago. And being that they're in fields on the side of hills and so on, there's erosion and there's agriculture. But with lots of these sites, we feel that they were used over a few hundred years, and then their purpose and changed. People started thinking about burial chambers and uses of these sites for other things. Remember, an acre of good agricultural land, or agricultural land that's on a slope is an area that's actually used for this process. That's what we'll call it. And it's quite a big area to use for a process like this. And there are other interpretations. For example, we found lots of these sites, lots of human remains, naturally, if that's the principal use, and lots of knives and blades and pottery sherds, animal bones as well. They're talking about feasting amongst your ancestors. And where that comes in is another complicated development of these sites. So it was once thought that each community had one of these causewayed enclosures in the Neolithic period. And each of the ditches, for example, represents a family. So we looked at something similar when we thought about the standing stones with that theory that me and Bill and Pat learnt about with the standing stones at the Ring of Brodka, that each stone represents family. So this idea that each ditch represents family, and just chucking something in there quickly, sometimes when you excavate these ditches, there's no bones in them, simply because the family removed the bones and put them in the burial chamber, or they moved elsewhere with their bones. It's that process of keeping your ancestors with you, a bit like a Victorian would keep some hair from a child with them in a locket or a bracelet of a now deceased wife around their wrist or something like that. You carry your ancestors, your loved ones with you. And, you know, some people carry their cremated relatives with them to different houses that they move to. I hear those stories. And in a way, we can maybe understand these sites a little bit more if we look at them in that way. So if we move on to the next image, and again, we're quite privileged to see what these sites look like from the way the archaeologists have excavated here. This one is roughly portraying Windmill Hill, as I've said, in Wiltshire near Avebury. We don't have any great examples like this in Cumbria or Cornwall or Cymru, and certainly none on Orkney. But what is clear is that these sites are relatively large. And what I'd like to do, I like to think a little bit more laterally when I think about these sites. So the inner concentric circle here are the first people that moved into the landscape. They are the ones who get the first ring of sausages in the middle, as it were. Those are the founders of the settlement. And then more people move into the area. That each of these represents another family. Yeah, and then the more people move into the area, and we have that evidence because Wiltshire, that landscape becomes very crowded, really, with Woodhenge, Avebury, down the road Stonehenge, and all the avenues and the Cursus monuments and the barrows and so on, really well occupied landscape. And you start to see these things as precursors to a developed cemetery. And these sites are described by some historians as wretched graveyards, the rank smell of the rotting corpses. And what you can see there is that you can clearly, it's showing smoke and stuff. Well, we don't really have evidence that they're cremating their loved ones. They're actually exposing their loved ones, sky burial, that, you know, bodies exposed to the environment, to then the bones are collected together and then put in the pits. Sometimes the pits are allowed open so that you can see the skulls and so on, and the long bones of your loved ones in the pits. But there are certain rules. I'll describe what those certain rules are now. The one rule is that in the Neolithic period, they did not expose the body of a child. And that is quite a tender thought. It was too difficult for even Neolithic people to expose a child in this way. So they would bury their children in the ditches. So this is why we're getting close to these ditches representing individual families across the whole Britain. It's said by some historians and archaeologists that the period of sky burial in Britain, if it was 6,000 years ago or 5,500 years ago, somewhere in the middle there, that for about 100 years, 75 years, one historian archaeologist said, all the communities across Britain are doing these things, except for different things going on in Orkney. which I will go on to, I promise. And the other rule is with these sites is that the way these sites worked is very different than the way we see the respect for our loved ones, because lots of the skulls that we find have been deliberately poleaxed. In other words, the person's passed on, they've been exposed, their skulls rolled off the platform, hit the ground, and you grab the skull while there's some brain matter in it, and you look at the skull and you put it on a pole. The sharp end of the pole goes through the skull, and you see the loved one's skull, and you talk to the loved one's skull. And as you're working on the landscape, the loved one looks out at you working on the landscape, and you can occasionally wave to them. This is just not fantasy. These are your family. And because life was very fast then, you couldn't spend hours mourning somebody or years mourning somebody as we do today. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not criticizing that. It's a tender area, actually. But the person's head would look out to you for a while, for somewhat time, and then eventually you'd take the head and you'd put it into the family ditch. So again, moving on again, and let's clear this. And lots of these causewayed enclosure sites, again, not in the areas we're looking at, but to give an example, lots of these causewayed enclosure sites have had later uses. So when you think about it, the Neolithic period's quite a long time from the Iron Age. So 3,000 years, say. And people come across these sites and they might not know what they mean. So the string of ditches, they join together and they create an Iron Age hill fort 3,000 years later. We see this a lot, actually. And Bill and Pat and I have been to Maiden Castle. Maiden Castle started off as a causewayed enclosure site, and then it got bigger and bigger, and it became the 50-odd acre site that it is today, from causewayed enclosure site like this. It's said that they draped off the side of hills. This is one near Chichester in Sussex. But these causewayed enclosure sites are not just empty vessels of assumptions and things that I'm actually telling you. They're areas of archaeology from quite rich archaeology. This is Neolithic art. So people use these causewayed enclosure sites to interact. And this is actually from a site, one of very few causewayed enclosure sites known in Cornwall. This is a site very near Truro. And this site was actually found very, very recently. We're talking about 2012. So only 8 years ago, actually. In lots of ways, we see in archaeology new types of sites every now and again being found, new categories. And there are a few odd ones in archaeology that we still need to understand a little bit better. Avenues from the Neolithic, cursus monuments from the Neolithic again, and bank barrows. We haven't found many of them, but we hadn't found many of these causewayed enclosures up until recently. And we've got 100 of them now across the country. So new categories of site do come up. Remains of a prehistoric enclosure have been discovered by archaeologists whilst they were examining a site near Truro, on the outskirts of Truro, to construct a Waitrose, for example. And this Neolithic site in Cornwall is very interesting because Cornwall fits in with the theme of things across Britain. And this is quite an early causewayed enclosure site near Truro, dating back to 5,800 years ago, nearly 6,000 years ago. And what we do see at the causewayed enclosure site there is stunning objects like the one in front of you, Neolithic art carved onto both sides of a slate disc like this. So arts found at these sites from the Neolithic period, and lots of Neolithic pottery. The work all funded by the Cornwall County Council. While it is important that we take the opportunity to learn about our findings now, best practice is for the site to be preserved for future generations of archaeologists who have better technologies to understand it than we can do today. Scientific analysis of evidence recovered during the excavation is expected to take some years after the sample excavation has concluded. So in other words, what they've done is that they've designed Waitrose around the site. So in other words, not really destroying the site. So it can be reburied and left for future generations to investigate. So this is the example in Cornwall, the way the Cornish do things. So a Causewayed enclosure, as I've already described, a large circular oval area. And these sites date to the early Neolithic period, a period which also saw an advancement in agriculture in Britain as well. So whilst people were in deep respect of their loved ones and exposing them and so on, they were very much engaged in agriculture as well. So that's the point I made. If you're ploughing your fields and looking after your animals, you don't have much time to mourn. So putting the head of a loved one on a spike, looking over you whilst you work in the fields, is a great tribute to that person that's passed away. And it was very difficult to get our minds around it. Poleaxing a skull of somebody that once lived a couple of months earlier, but then that person is still part of society. So we see at this time lots of changes. So Causewayed enclosures are really important because it brings on ceremonial landscapes like the Ness of Bodger, and like Stonehenge, and like Avebury, and like Stanton Drew, and like the ceremonial landscapes of Cornwall and some upland areas of Cumbria. So these Causewayed enclosures at the beginning of this major change in Britain, the Neolithic, the new Stone Age. So these sites themselves are naturally usually associated with settlements. And this one, the one that they found in Truro, isn't a huge one. It's 70 meters across. But nevertheless, it's one example of a Causewayed enclosure site in Cornwall. And obviously with this beautiful piece of art in front of you. Let's get my images up. I think this is rather amazing. You see a more as a chessboard type design, but it's quite these sort of art and crafts of sort of modernist type of art stuff that we may have seen in the 20s and 30s, only 100 years ago. So that's that site in Truro. There it is, and it's, as I say, we don't find many of these sites in Cornwall, but we are finding them, and that gives you an idea of scale, the size of a human head, and it's got that wonderful design on it. So in many ways, the Causewayed enclosure is our way of telling us that society's developing, society's changing, families are growing, and there's a sense of family. There's a sense of family, and then community, and then community start to build the other sites that we've mentioned, like Barrows and Henge sites and so on. But this is all before that. I used to say that this is a time that family was paramount, family within a community rather than community coming first. There weren't lords and kings and rulers 6,000 years ago that ruled over countries. That didn't happen. That didn't happen for quite some time. But these examples are actually from a book published by James Dyer. And James Dyer tells us a lot about these Causewayed enclosure sites. and their meaning and significance and importance to our past. And if, as Causewayed enclosure sites have been reused for Bronze Age settlements and Iron Age hill forts, and there's been a lot of agriculture, not as many of them survive as we would want them to survive, but naturally changes occur, but they are being detected by new technology like aerial photography and LiDAR. And aerial photography and LiDAR were the techniques that allowed us to really find them in our own land, very much so. And the one on this illustration in front of you, number 3, rather interesting, tells you of a site, a community that probably didn't get any bigger as the one above, which is at Windmill Hill. And you got lots of these, whatever's going on with all of these, communities are growing, but not the one, number 3. Now this, spot the Causewayed enclosure, aerial photography, finding our first major Causewayed enclosure site, the most significant one dating to 1990. Up until that point, we had thought there was some in Cymru, but hadn't really found them. And this one here, this is actually in West Wales, and you can clearly see it. What you can see is the shadows created on the landscape. Snow is absolutely brilliant to aerial photography in detecting sites, because what happens is that as long as you don't get deep snow, as the snow falls in the hollows, as you can see in the ditches associated with the Causewayed enclosure, hang on, there, and then you've got another row, you've got another concentric circle below. Some of this has been lost due to erosion because it's on the side of a slope. And because of the arrangement of the sun at this type of year, it creates shadows into the ditches, builds up the snow, creating shadows and so on. So this is really useful for archaeologists with snow, with aerial photography. And sites like these, if it wasn't for aerial photography, would be very difficult to find on the ground. So I don't know if Bill's had this experience with me. I'm telling him there's a ditch here, Bill. There is. No, there's not. There is. I know, because I've seen the aerial photography and you just can't find it on the ground. And that's the point, you see. By aerial photography really helps us learn and understand the landscape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to another little bit of an image, and then that's where we are. This was one of the first ones found in the whole of Wales, Puncheston, Pembrokeshire. And then later on, the examples, the example that I was sort of part of finding was found near Ogmore by Sea. And that was in 1997, 1998. And then we've got ones in North Wales that have been found, and we've got ones in the heart of Wales around Newtown as well. And we've got other ones that have been found in the Vale of Glamorgan. So they really, aerial photography has really helped us understand these sites. So again, you can just about see this really weird Causewayed enclosure site. So you can see that there, follow it around, follow it back around there, back around there, back around there, all the way around, all the way around. And you can see it sort of facing the base of the hill here. And then you've got another one as well. So this is the earlier one that sort of fades a little bit. So you've got two concentric circles, and this is far away from Wiltshire. This is very far away from Cornwall. But there's this tradition, there's this style that's going across most of Britain, other than Orkney, for example. I'll just tell you a little bit about this site. And this site itself is known at a site known as Newin at Puncheston in Pembrokeshire. This site is known as Bankthy. And Bankthy is the first completely conclusive, confirmed Neolithic enclosures found in 1990. And it comprises two elements: an oval, smaller inner circuit and an enlarged outer circuit as well. So it describes this: the defences survive in earthwork form, comprising a single rampart where they traverse the relatively flat summit, blah, blah, blah. So obviously later on, it's evidence to say that after this was used as a causewayed enclosure, it's likely that some of the ditches were joined together to actually form some uninterrupted arrangements. But from what you can actually see on the chart, they are interrupted. And what they've done with this, rather interesting enough, so that date of the site in Cornwall, approximately 3,800, 3,600 years BC, nearly 6,000 years ago, this example is more or less the same date as the one in Cornwall, dating back to 3,650 years BC. And it's amazing that we've got a fashion of these causewayed enclosures across the whole of Britain. And they got that date because they excavated one of the ditches, and the earliest evidence in the ditches gives us that date of 3,650 years BC. And it's absolutely fascinating that we do have that archaeological evidence for such an amazing, intricate, fascinating period of our past. And we'll, again, you know, aerial photography is brilliant, because you look on the earlier image, that's sort of that's going to be springtime when the grass is getting lush and it's not parched. And that's a little bit later on, where the grass is a little bit parched with different light. And it's almost as if, even though it's faint, even though these ditches are faint here and they're relatively faint here, they're very much clearer with the other light. And as archaeologists have been examining this site, you can actually clearly see back to the snow that these are the interrupted bits of the ditches. And some of this has almost been joined together at a later stage. But again, this is a very, very large site indeed, very, very large site. And again, tells you of the importance of mourning, tells us of the importance of celebration, looking at people's lives. This was a prime bit of the landscape, because as you can see around it, this is really good, rich agricultural land. Would have been immediately after the trees had been felled anyway. So again, the importance, these are cathedrals to the ancestors, in other words. Cathedrals of reverence, cathedrals to times gone by, and a sense of remembrance of people that were very important to you. And they remain important to you as they watch out over the landscape with their heads on spikes. It's a very weird concept, but it is. And again, the importance of aerial photography. But before we go to Keswick in Cumbria, I would like to introduce these sites in the Vale of Glamorgan. I will actually show you where they are at the end. That's why I wanted to put that image in at the end. But I wanted to, these causewayed enclosures, interrupted ditch enclosures, that's another name for them apparently. So the Neolithic period is usually seen to represent a new and dynamic era in human history. That's a very good way of putting it. Very different from the one that prevailed for the previous thousands of years. The domestication of plants, animals, the social interaction and communication with people. People began to embrace novel ideas, novel ways of being with their landscape, not just with their animals and their plants, but understanding the sedentary form of life. If you're going to stay in one place, you may as well keep your loved ones very close, and you're there and they're there, and that's the way it's going to be. So you've got the pottery and you've got the textile. New ideologies were reflected in the way people treated the dead and living alike. different zones, the division of the landscape, and then leading into landscapes like Stonehenge, like the very interesting burial ancestral type of landscape of Cornwall and other parts of the country. The origins of Causewayed enclosures very much take us to the southwest, and they vary considerably in their design. You do actually have Causewayed enclosures that have stone walls in Cornwall, for example, to the earthwork constructions that I've been actually showing you. So in lots of ways, the idea of the Causewayed enclosure may have actually originated in the southwest, in places like Cornwall. So that's another rare thing that the Cornish are famous for, Causewayed enclosures. They're not famous for very much else. These themselves, then we start to find these rolling out across the country. And not just with one example in the Vale of Glamorgan, several examples in the Vale of Glamorgan, all found from around 1997, 1998. An example at Ueni, an example at Corntown, and the one that I was involved in at Norton in the Vale of Glamorgan. And the one at Norton in the Vale of Glamorgan, I'll tell you about this at the end, but the one at Norton in the Vale of Glamorgan, we had been field walking in this field, finding bits of Neolithic flint and bits of Neolithic pottery, and we didn't really know what to make of it. And after all, 1997 was 23 years ago. I'm a lot more wiser now, but I didn't know what all this meant. And then there's a story associated with that, which I'll tell you about later. So these enclosures in the Vale of Glamorgan, in the three localities that I mentioned, in Ueni, Corntown and Norton, lie on very slight slopes on the Carboniferous limestone geology. And there might be a closer interaction with the river itself, and massively as well, in 2006, there's been identified a further concentric enclosure of Flemingstone in the Vale of Glamorgan. So that's 4, maybe 5 Causewayed enclosure sites. And again, with this new technology, we're really starting to understand this Neolithic past that we hadn't done before. The site where I was actually trying to think of earlier on was a site in Radnorshire, Walton. And I remember actually going there as well. And that was a new site when I actually visited there in the 90s. So aerial photography helps us see things that you can't actually see on the ground. So next we go to Keswick. We go to Cumbria. And the site at Keswick is, again, taking us to another interesting part of the landscape. Hang on a minute. Oh, hang on. I thought these images were better, but this is a very strange Causewayed enclosure site at Keswick. Hang on, am I going to be able to enlarge on this better? Actually, do you know what I'm going to do? I've got a little article where this actually comes from. So we will actually show you the article be better. The images are a lot better on that. So let's just go straight to the article and not the images that we find. So that's from Keswick in the sort of central eastern part of Cumbria. And I'm going to do a new little bit of a share. So this one. So Keswick. So you can see that there's a number of these weird circular sites at this locality. And if we're allowed to look at this, are you seeing? I've pressed another button. Are you actually seeing a weird square, strange-looking site, Bill?
I am. Yep. It looks Roman.
It does look Roman, but it's not. It's a very. This has actually been identified as a Causewayed enclosure site. But what's happened is because of the way it's sort of draped on the hill. All the ditches have been added together, but we've got Neolithic evidence to tell us that this is the Causewayed enclosure site. And the interesting thing, it's alongside 3 other sites. And I tell you what, this would be an absolutely brilliant landscape to actually visit, because you've got these like 3 monuments running from the Neolithic period all the way through to probably into the Roman period, actually, because that thing there looks very odd. But let's keep us to the Neolithic period, the site that we're actually looking at there. And this has been described in Cumbria as follows. A Neolithic Causewayed enclosure on Green Howe, Cumbria. Under low, slanting sunlight on the evening of the 16th of June 2000, routine reconnaissance by the English Heritage Aerial Survey team discovered what appears to be the first Neolithic Causewayed enclosure to be recognised in northern England. That's quite a statement, really. Causewayed enclosure sites, as it's saying, giving us some dates there. So we say 3,700 years BC, so 3,400 years BC. That in that range, I said a few hundred years. Probably to serve as arenas for periodical communal gatherings. Well, not for that, because it's clear that they're used for burials, but that's communal activity anyway. And that's a really good statement as well. They're the oldest, some of the oldest and rarest field monuments, prehistoric monuments in the whole of Britain. In view of the potential importance of this monument that we're seeing in Cumbria, they've actually undertaken extensive survey. The enclosure lies on Green Howe, a prominent hill on Ogger Hatry Fell. Naturally, it's on a hill. And although just taking in the highest point of the hill, the enclosure tips across the contours on the slope facing towards the lower lying ground. This is what Causewayed enclosure is about. And why? You want to know why? Yes. Now, I used to talk about these sites a lot, and I used to say that if you look from another hillock, you can actually see into the middle of the Causewayed enclosure. You can actually see what's going on in the middle. They're actually showing you them. You're meant to see the process of the exposure and the sky burial of these people, and you're meant to see inside them. Usually overlooked by other hills, so they slant on the side. A characteristic recognised as typical of other Causewayed enclosures throughout Europe. It's the type of thing they did. But some of those areas, not on massive gradients, and pretty good agricultural land as well. And they would have been in areas where trees would have been felled. So somebody's gone through the effort of felling the trees, and then agriculture, and then they think, right, we've got more land now, we'll just use this as an area for our loved ones. And after so much effort to clear the trees within the landscape, you're using an acre, maybe 2.5 acres of land, a whole hectare, as a Causewayed enclosure site. A lot of effort has gone into clearing this site, a bit of agriculture, and then you use it for this. So here we go, assuming that it occupied a clearing in the forest that probably would have covered the area at that date. The monument would have been clearly visible for some considerable distance across the Solway Plain. Again, you could see it over a long distance. They were meant to be seen. On the top of a hill, they're not going to be seen because they could be hidden. You were meant to look at this site. This one that we're talking about in Cumbria, the enclosure survives as well preserved low earthwork. So obviously the string of sausages has stopped becoming a string of sausages. It's all been, all the gaps themselves have been closed up. And it's saying that there may have been about 6 or 7 main segments initially. And which would represent 6 or 7 individual families, which is great. So a work in progress, a lot more they could actually learn from this site. And lots of these, as it's saying, a point that I made earlier on, lots of these Neolithic Causewayed enclosure sites are degraded appearance. In the British Isles, Neolithic Causewayed enclosures have a distribution concentration in South England, and we get them, that one identified in Anglesey. I said there'd been one identified in Anglesey, Northern Ireland, Wales, the Isle of Man. and we've got up to 100 now. So this is actually, this piece looks like it was written a few years ago actually, and it hasn't actually been updated. But we've got this nice example in Cumbria, and I thought that was actually great because it's last week. I think we missed out Cumbria actually, and which was a bit of a shame. So what I'd like to do is just sort of just show the type of site that we've been looking at again. There you go. So all those 6 or 7 ditches have been added together. And again, you've got other weird sites from the landscape from the Iron Age. Really strange, this one. And these sort of 3 sites together. Tell you what, Bill, be a really good place to visit Keswick. And you know, Bill, you could you and I could stay with Claire.
Put it on the wish list.
Yep, but I wouldn't be able to stay with Claire because Michelle would be intensely jealous. So, oh, and she's got a double bed available, Claire. That's where I slept when I was there. Anyway, giving away my secrets. So, anyway, so the next site that we're going to look at is Bill. We've gone from Causewayed enclosure sites. The topic tonight was sky burials. So we've gone, Bill, to Isbister, which is the site on Orkney known as the what?
Where? Say it again.
Isbister. There's a museum. There's a woman there that you fell in love with. And it wasn't Julie Gibson.
Isbister.
South Ronaldsley.
Oh, right. You mean the Tomb of the Eagles?
Tomb of the Eagles, that's it. We're going there next. Sky burials. Yep, remember?
Cool. Yep.
Yes. Well, that's where we've gone next. So so let's get straight into this. So let's so what we're looking at, you're looking at a ground plan of where we are. So we'll come back to this in a minute. I need to show you where we are. Oh, hang on. There it is. That's where we're going. So we got Northern Scotland and we've got Orkney. And you've got to go over the Churchill Barrier Avenue across all the bits of shipwrecks.
You have.
You go to South Ronaldsley. And I'm sure if Boris Johnson was convinced you could link up islands, right, we would definitely get a bridge to Ireland if he knew about this one. But we won't tell him. So again, the Tomb of the Eagles, that's where we're going to go. So it'd be nice to give you a little bit of information. So why have we gone from Causewayed enclosure sites? I'm really feeling frustrated now, Goff he's thinking, why we've gone from Causewayed enclosure sites to this site. But this is doing a very similar thing to the Causewayed enclosure site. Sky burial, bodies exposed on platforms, and then the difference is they're then placed into a chamber. Right, that's the difference. And the talons of sea eagles are placed in there as well. So it's likely that the sea eagles were feasting on the sets of human remains. This is where all this links in. It's a tenuous link, but I did say sky burials, so I'm sticking to what I said. So what we've got is a site that you can actually crawl into. And it's, let's have a nice bit of information, but let's have a little look at the landscape as well. Sort of an indication of a sky burial. There's Jake. So what we're going to do is that's where this monument is, and it's by here. So it's sort of on the coastline, and it probably would have been slightly away from the coast back then because of water regression and all the rest of it. So there's some of the talons. So you've got a skull, good, and we've got the tomb. And that's Kathy. So
yeah, Carl, you've still got the photograph, the wrong photograph up there. We can't see the Tomb of the Eagles. You've almost switched over.
All right. Do you know what? Now, if this was Goff, you would have gone through the rest of the lecture with me showing different slides, and we wouldn't have changed. So you are right, Bill. So there we go. Are you at the Tomb of the Eagles?
Yeah, we are. That's it.
That's Kathy. And that's Pat.
On your belly, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where we are. We're sort of on Orkney, Tomb of the Eagles, and what we've got is this plan. So let's do a little bit of detail on this one. Let's go for it. My notes. And so the Tomb of the Eagle, Isbister, chambered Khan, a Neolithic chambered tomb. But again, it's got the same date as everything that we're talking about, very much so. And it's located near the cliff edge, as I've already mentioned. And it was first found in 1958 by a Ronald Simison, a farmer digging for flagstones. And basically thought, oh my God, I found a load of skulls. So now this guy, Ronald Simison, conducted his own excavations in 1976. And Simison, archaeologist John Hedges, then mounted a full study, prepared a technical report, and wrote a popular book that cemented the tomb's name, i.e. a book called The Tomb of the Eagles. Makes sense. So they found, wait for it, clenching my teeth, 16,000 human bones. Now, if you think about 16,000 human bones and you forget about all the phalanges and the metatarsals, and you get rid of a few teeth and all the rest of it. So that must be representative of quite a number of people. So it said, for example, that I think I can remember back in a time that there was evidence of around 36 skulls. That's what springs into my mind. But 16,000 bones is representative of a much, much larger number of people. And why is it called the Tomb of the Eagles? I've mentioned because you find there's the remains from 725 mainly seabirds. These predominantly belonging to the white-tailed sea eagle, and the point is with these bones is that they tell you the interaction between the sea eagle. And I made a little mistake. There were 725 bones from the sea eagle representing 20 individuals. I needed to put that in there, right? But it's still a large number of these very rare birds, the assemblage within the tomb itself. And there's been lots of discussion what these birds absolutely represent. Do they represent those birds, the popular feasted on human remains? And then they were revered because feasting on human remains, they've taken the spirit of this upper being, a human, and then the birds are revered. And in particularly, the bones that we do find are of the talons of the sea eagle. So these were originally interpreted as a foundation deposit. However, this interpretation has been challenged by new dating techniques. And it reveals somewhat that the eagles are up to have been deposited, the remains of the sea eagles have been deposited 1,000 years after the people's bodies were originally exposed. That could mean anything, but it could still be related to the exposure of the individuals in the form of sky burial. But the sea eagles are revered and they're placed, the bones, this is what's important, that the bones of the sea eagle are actually entombed with the bones of human beings, which 1,000 years after the human remains are in there. But people are still got a connection with the tomb after 1,000 years. And the date, this is what's interesting, the date for the sky burial that's going on in Orkney dates to exactly the same that Causewayed enclosure sites are being used for sky burial, 3,500, 3,600 years BC. So it's around the same time as well. So the same type of thing is happening. So the talons themselves, the remains of the sea eagle, may represent a reverence for the tomb and the association with the sea eagle and the bones and the humans and the feasting, the sky burial for 1,000 years. Tombs being used for generation after generation, well after Causewayed enclosure sites are just no longer the sites used in southern England and in Cumbria and Wales and other places, whatever. But in Orkney, the population is less, and it's less concentrated in Orkney. And it's likely that sky burial continued for a very, very long time in Orkney, as opposed to sky burial, Causewayed enclosure sites being used in England. And access into the tomb via a 3-meter long narrow tunnel, and visitors can get in there using a wheeled trolley and then stand up in the interior of the tomb. It's a really weird one, and it's been the subject of a number of television programs. Now, I've got to be honest with you on one issue. Lots of the owners of this site, of this site, do the sea eagle bit, sky burial, bodies being exposed, and so on and so on. That's what they do. And other archaeologists say, they didn't really have sky burials in Orkney, but I believe, like the owners of this site, that they did. And there's something else. Bill, what else can you remember about these skulls? Come on, Bill. You're great. You held a skull. Tell us.
I did. It was 5,000 years old, back in the visitor centre. The lady there, who I think was the granddaughter of the original discoverer.
Yes.
It was a very strange experience, actually, holding the skull of a 5,000-year-old man. It really was.
But what did she say about that skull? Can you remember?
No.
If you Pat, Pat's been muted, unfortunately. But I think if Pat can remember, I can certainly remember, the skulls were of special people. Can you remember there was lots of deformities with the skulls?
No, I can't, Carl.
There was. That's why I didn't handle it. There was actually deformities with the skull, and it said that the people in that chamber were actually the age range was something between teenager to about 20 years old. That was most of them, represented by the skulls, not because we got 16,000 bones there. So this is what the skulls told us, and that's another interesting thing that we go with these sky burials, that certain people's bodies were exposed and not all of society. And that's another important point, because when we looked at the sky burials in southern England, for example, I mentioned that children bodies weren't exposed, only adults' bodies were exposed. Well, in this case, teenagers to 20-year-olds with genetical deformities in their bone structure. So these were exposed, and then the bodies, the bones and all the rest of it collected together and then placed into this chamber. But most of there's a good assemblage of bones, probably because there's not as many scavenging animals in Orkney as there, say, as in Wiltshire, for example. So as you go into this 3-meter long this 3-meter long tunnel, and you go into this, which is covered like by a little bit of a mound, and then you've got a chamber itself that is no more than about 7 meters in length, but quite considerable. And you can go in there, which we're going to do now. So you go into here, and yeah, I can remember this really well. I can remember having a photograph taken out by Clive when I got out. So this is the book, The Tomb of the Eagles. And this is what we're talking about with sky burial. So that's a bit of a reconstruction there. And what they were saying was that you would put the bodies on a platform, and they would be feasted upon by birds and so on. And then the bones would be collected together and then arranged in one of the chambers. So you've got the, you could say the hall, which is from B to A, and then you put the bones in these individual chambers. And in one of them, there's actually remains of dogs, but not this one. You've got the chamber of the dog bones in Orkney as well. This is the Tomb of the Eagles. So again, a platform. So what we were talking about with the Causewayed enclosure site behind us in England, you're talking about wooden platforms and so on. And there you go. So what you've got most of the long bones in there, a collection of skulls. Lots of these with genetical deformities on them. And I tell you what, this would be a very eerie sight to actually see this. And these are all corbelled, they're nice corbelled roofing in them. And that's Pat on her way out. And that's Kathy. And again, getting you an idea of scale, you can stand up in there. And what they've done, because lots of it is actually collapsed in, the corbelling of the roof has been replaced by a concrete dome, but but you get natural light in there, which is great. I wouldn't go there in the dark, simply because it's near the cliff. And I can remember we went to similar sites like this in when we went to the island of Sanday. But this is specifically associated with sky burial. And there is one of the skulls and some of the talons from these sea eagles. And again, the link between the talons, the skulls, and sky burial. So
there was a tomb of the otters as well, Carl, wasn't there? Not far away.
Say that again. The tomb of the what?
Otters.
Ah, yes, the tomb of the otters. Yes.
After our visit.
Yeah, that's right. The tomb of the otters. Yes. And again, very close to the cliff, but with lots of things, the landscape changes. But we've got, again, all this links together quite nicely today. And I'm just going to double check, because we have actually come to the end now. So, oh, no, we haven't come to the end, because I got one last thing to show you. So we are here. So we've moved completely away from the sky burial site on Orkney, and we've gone back to sky burial, the South Wales way, the Cymru way. And the story has it that I had been field walking in this field, and we'd been finding lots of Neolithic flint sort of along here. And we had been doing it, I think, from late 96, I think, 97. And then on a Sunday, I'm not making this up now, on a Sunday, in this field, there was a gang of archaeologists from the National Museum of Wales. And there was a gang from Archaeology Cumbria, right? And it was really, really strange. The archaeologist heading the group, a certain Dr. Stephen Burrows, stood in the middle of the road with his trowel. And I stood in the middle of the road with my trowel. And he said to me, "What are you doing here?" And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, we've got permission to be here." And he said, "We've got permission to be here." And he said, "What have you found?" And I said, "Well, what have you found?" And he said, "I can't tell you." And I said, "I can't tell you what I found either." Anyway, it turned out that through aerial photography, he had found a Causewayed enclosure. And we had found the Neolithic site, not knowing it was a Causewayed enclosure. From that moment onwards, me and that other archaeologist haven't seen eye to eye. And that actually happened. And this is the site of the Causewayed enclosure. And I'm going to try and draw it if my technology works. It's basically something like that. Over that area is a Causewayed enclosure. And it's quite strange, but we were finding flint where the ditch was, and we didn't know what this meant. Moral of the story is, I don't know what the moral of the story is, but aerial photography through this whole lecture today, the whole seminar, has been very interesting in helping us understand these Causewayed enclosure sites. So more comparison next week. So what I'd like to do, I'm sure there's going to be a few questions tonight. So first of all, from you, Bill.
Yeah, a few years back, Carl, if you remember, and I'm sure you do, we made a visit to Stormy Down to visit the remains of Sturmey Castle, found a standing stone,
Oh
and
God.
visited
Yeah.
the site of the medieval village.
Yeah.
And next to the village was a low wooded area. We went in there and we found a circular structure, which I think we concluded was a Causewayed enclosure. Do you remember that?
Oh my God. Did you know what? I'd forgotten that and I need to go back there. I knew there was a reason. Thank you,
Yeah.
Bill.
We also found something which resembled a
Ah,
souterrain as well.
yeah. Shh. That's not been discovered yet.
So you'd forgotten that one, had you?
No, I hadn't forgotten that. That's going to be discovered.
Ah, yes, you had.
No,
Yes, you
no,
had.
no, I'd forgotten the other thing, but that's going to be discovered early next year.
Oh, okay.
That hasn't been discovered yet, Bill.
Yeah.
Right, because as you know, I think of a bit like Howard Carter. When you need to make discoveries, you dig into your old chest. So what we're going to do now, I would like to hear from Rosamund. I haven't heard a dick from you, Rosamund.
Well, I've done very well, haven't I? Keeping quiet. I very interesting, and the shape of the you know how they've evolved. So did standing stones evolve from these causeway enclosure sites?
Yes. Basically, what you think about if you take the outside ditch here, right? So obviously, a few hundred years go by, the ditches are filled in, whatever. If you take the outside ditch and you join that all together, and you have maybe an entrance and an exit, right? That's Stonehenge, and that's Avebury.
And so there would have been perhaps ceremonial walks in.
Yeah, that's right.
Out.
Yeah.
And that's how the labyrinth perhaps comes into it.
Yeah, the labyrinth is in your mind, as you know, right? The sense of the maze and the labyrinth is in your mind. It's only physically being done in the modern way, a labyrinth and a maze. A labyrinth and a maze is all to do with avoidance. So if something's saying you don't go there, it's not a physical barrier, but it's a ditch or whatever, and it's not your space, you don't go there. So it's all that concept. Stone circle develop,
pathways.
Yeah.
And the other thing was that you know that the people were still had the connection after 1,000 years. You know, we're still looking, say, at Jesus 2,000 years later. I found that interesting too, and the aerial photography put everything into perspective. Exactly. Fascinating lecture, Carl, especially at this time of year.
Exactly. And I tell you one thing, that this is Pam, because she's a devout Christian and she's very much linked to Jesus. So we're going to go next. Pam.
How do you know that?
Well, because I was speaking to Jesus the other night. He said he loves you.
Yeah, he does, actually. No, I haven't got anything to ask. That's strange, isn't it?
That is, oh my God, and you sounded really clear.
Yeah.
Oh my God. My God, that's amazing. It don't go for you that way, does it? You know.
No.
So
sorry.
So right, okay then. Pat, go on, Pat.
Right, two things. On your drawing behind you.
Yeah, Pat, you're sounding so faint, like a porn star from the 70s. So if we can have you a bit louder.
I'll try. Hello.
I've got you. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. On that drawing behind you.
Yeah.
What would the ditch be that they buried their ancestors? Is it inside the circle or is it behind?
Well, actually, this is this is quite a bad example, because it's what you've got. If you see the lower ditch, usually what we're going to do is, if I show you back to let's go. We're looking a really good example. Go. I'm glad nobody's got. So if you look at these examples here, it's usually you've got a small family ditch, and basically the internal ditches, the internal centric circle is for the first people in the area. Then the next concentric circle and the next one, and that as time goes by, they add these ditches together for whatever reasons. So that's what's going on.
So the sausages are sort of built up by where they dig and pile up the soil.
No, the ditch. The sausage is actually the ditch.
Oh, but they stick up.
Ah, no, no, that's a ditch.
Oh, okay.
No, that's a ditch. I'll just no. I see what you're saying. Basically, you've got the ditch, and above the ditch, you've got the bank.
Yes, that's it. The bank. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you, yeah, basically you've got this clearer now. So the brown bit is the ditch, and the white bit is the bank.
Okay, so they're actually buried on the outside of the circle, sort of.
Well, actually, in this example, you've got a bank and a ditch, and then you've got a ditch and a bank. There's no rules to it.
Okay, okay.
So in other words, basically, an Irish community moved into the area, so they did it the other way around.
The other thing, I remember you took us Hela Q, and that was a Causewayed enclosure, wasn't it? Above Hela Q?
Oh, yeah, we went to Hela Q. Do you know what? We never worked that one out at all, but I remember mentioning possibly that that was a weird looking hill fort type thing that you couldn't work out, but that could be likely to be a Causewayed enclosure that's become a hill fort. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Again, yeah. Thanks both of you for giving me extra work, Bill and Pat. Probably things I was meant to do back in the day, and now I've got to relook at them. Great. Okay. It's a thanks for that, Pat. And look at Pete. I got to look at his hair, and I would like to put. Do you know what? He would really look good with the symbol that Gorbachev used to have on his head. Go on, Pete. Anything?
No, not really. Except probably these hill forts and the enclosures. They were probably situated on ley lines.
Oh.
And associated with Celts. Is that what you're going to say?
Not necessarily, but with ley lines. And
Yeah,
because you got a similar situation that's distributed around the British Isles.
yeah.
And there must have been a connection between them because they're so similar.
You want to check it out, don't you? You want to look at the White Horse, Uffington. Uffington would have started off.
Well, there we found that was a ley line, didn't we?
Yeah,
with Michelle's dowsing rods.
Exactly. And yeah, because Uffington would have definitely started out as a Causewayed enclosure as well, and then later into hill fort. Yeah, so that's this is really working well today. Everyone knows what they're talking about except for Rosamond. And talking about people, right? I know, Stav, if you want to say anything, we're not going to embarrass you. Put your mic on now, but don't be shy. But if you don't want to say anything, Stav, then that's fine. That's okay. And Goff, you've got the last say tonight.
Yeah, this concept of sky burials, is that the same as you find the original people of North America?
Yes, very much so. And India, there's lots of cultures still do sky burial today.
We do, Carl, in India. In particular, in India, there's a place in India which practices sky burials to this very day. I can't remember the name of the group, but there are, yeah.
On the banks of the Ganges, yeah, I know.
Okay, very good, Carl. Very interesting.
I wanted to do you something that I probably struggled more than usual because it was trying to bring in the Orkney site into this, but because I did say sky burials, it's a very different site, but it's exactly the same concept, and it's like looking at two different religions, but they both bury, and that's what I wanted to look at. So I'm gonna. So we've obviously got another one next week, so that's great. So if there's no other questions, I'll see you all next week, and I'll see some of you tomorrow. And so I'm going to say good. If anyone wants to chat afterward, that's fine. But if not, thank you very much. That's really good. I really liked that tonight. So good night, Goff, Pam,
Bye.
Peter, Pat, Stav, Rosamond, and Bill. Night, guys. Girls. Hold there.
Hail.
Diolch yn fawr I gyd. Right, that's it. Okay. Nos da, Pete. Bye. Bye-bye. So those that are still here with me now, I just wanted to do a little bit of promotional stuff at the end. So just if you want to watch this, and here we go. We do lots of classes with Archaeology Cymru online, so anyone's welcome to join us. The email address is there, www.archaeologycymruonline.weebly.com. And I've got a live show next year. Again, if you want to book for that, that's in Chepstow. It's live, actually in person, www.KARL-JAMES in Chepstow. We'll be looking at the Pavlan Cave, the fraud, the faked body at Pavlan Cave, and some entertainment, and looking at the reinvention of the history of Cymru. And this last, hang on a minute, I'll just show this one now. That's me, KARL-JAMES Langford. Thanks for watching this today. Comparison of archaeology. Another 4 classes to go. Lots more interesting comparison sites. We've already put 4 on so far. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr i chi, and see you next week.